I'm ready.
Hey everyone. Yeah, we are live. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Tech Talks with Santosh. And this is really, I would say, a special episode for me because Lars was the first guest for the first episode of Tech Talks with Santosh. And here we are back again with Lars. And thanks for joining us, Lars.
Thank you for having me again. Last
Yeah.
time I was here, it was actually Tech Talks with not Santosh, and I was the host.
Yeah, actually. So Lars was also host for the first episode of 2021, and thanks a lot for doing that as well. I was stuck. I was traveling, and then I reached out to Lars, and he said, "Okay, let me do it." And yeah, that was an amazing episode as well. So last month, I reached out to Lars and said, "Let's have another episode, and this time on testing." And then he's shared the idea. Let's do it, but let's take the questions from community. I was like, okay, let's do it. And we got some amazing questions from the community, and that's what we are going to discuss about today. So I'll be speaking like very less until unless you guys have any questions. Otherwise, it will be all over to the last, and he will be sharing all those questions as well as the solutions to those. And at the end, we have spectacular, like right. So we will also introduce you to spectacular, and this is yep. So let's go ahead and let's get started. I'm really excited for this episode. Over to you, Lars.
Thank you, Santosh. Yeah, I'm working at a company called Systemate, and we live and breathe continuous delivery and continuous deployment. So, of course, automated testing is a very important part of our developer flow. Um, so, yeah, I have like 4 years experience with Angular and testing Angular also. So and Angular is a bit special because it requires a lot of additional setup to be able to test it. Angular has a lot of different types of software artifacts, like different types of classes, like components, directives, modules, and so on. And Angular does have a testing utility or testing APIs built in, but they take some getting used to, and that's what I hope to cover today.
Mhm.
We collected some questions, as you said, from Twitter, and I built a very long presentation based on these questions. Um, there's a lot of code. That's one of the reasons it's long. I don't really like live coding, so I have all the codes in the slides, and you can benefit from looking them up later if there's something you want to take a closer look at. The examples I'm using are primarily real world examples taken from real libraries and some of the best tests from the Angular documentation. So yeah, it's not just made up examples. It's actual real world code. So I hope that we can come to a common understanding about what a test looks like and what an Angular test looks like. So let me start this presentation. I just need to rearrange my windows a bit. Here we go. The first section is about Angular testing fundamentals or testing fundamentals in general, because the first question here is from Nacho Vasquez, a good friend of ours, and he's asking, um, or maybe you'd like to ask the questions.
Yeah, sure, Lars. That'll be good. So, okay, so now Nacho had this question: what path would you recommend for a beginner making their way into testing?
Yeah, so this is my personal recommendation, specifically for Angular. There's these free online resources. There's three different text-based online workshops. So it's a Git repo, and you get instructions on what to do, and there's solutions as well.
Hmm.
I helped update the third one by Victor Meyer. I
Hmm.
updated that for Angular 10 not too long ago, so that's up to date, and I've used it myself with my company and our customers. It's a really good
Hmm.
workshop. I know Christian Yanker and Juan Herrera as well, and I know they're doing good content as well. So those are the other workshops. There's also some online text and video guides. Of course, on Angle.io we have on the developer guides we have testing. There's a bit of information about all the different aspects of Angular testing, but it doesn't really go in depth. And I would go so far as to say as most of the tests there are not really close to the real world. They're more like trying to give you a very basic introduction to what is possible with the Angular testing APIs, but it doesn't represent good tests using best practices. But nonetheless, that's the source you start with on Angular APIs for testing. There's also this pretty old website by now, but it's still relevant, by Asim Hussain. It's called CodeCraft TV. There's free text and video guides about everything Angular, and one of them is unit testing. It's short recipes, so it's really helpful actually. I've used it a lot myself during my career of using Angular. Also, since this is a long session, I think we'll be taking a break at some point, right? In 45 minutes mark or so.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is everything I recommend, and you can look them up with the links in the slides. I'll share them afterwards. This book is probably the only book about Angular testing, but it's also a good book. So I really highly recommend that for anyone interested in Angular testing. It goes beyond the Angular testing guide and covers everything to some degree about testing Angular. It also introduces testing in general, but with a focus on Angular testing, which is the important part here, as we'll see. So in general, what do you need to know about testing? This is some of this is common between unit tests, integration tests, and end-to-end test. This is general knowledge you should acquire if you want to do automated testing. The first thing we'll look at here is the different testing frameworks. These are the different unit testing frameworks, but only two of them are, or three of them actually, are widely used with Angular. But in theory, you could, if you wanted to set up your toolchain yourself, you could use any of these for unit and integration testing. The one that comes with Angular CLI, of course, is Karma, which builds on top of Jasmine. And then there's Jest is also very popular. It's created by Facebook, and it was inspired by or built on top of Jasmine. I think it's pretty much a standalone product at this point. But yeah, it's also highly popular in the Angular community, and both has their pros and cons. I won't really get into that, but just be aware there's a lot of options, and you can use other tools than what comes with Angular CLI. For example, there's a community Angular builder for Jest, and if you use NX, there's an official Angular builder for Jest from now on. Even with end-to-end testing frameworks, there's also a lot of choices. Out of the box, we get Protractor with Angular, but Cypress has also been becoming very popular. But there's a ton of other options out there. Like I won't get into the details of these ones, but just know that there's a lot to pick from, and anyone can work with Angular. In fact, the Test Cafe suite is very similar to Cypress and is equally mature. And Concept has a lot of interesting things, so that's also worth checking out. You might know Puppeteer as well. It's you can control a Chromium browser through your code, and Playwright is Microsoft's new end-to-end testing framework. With some of the people that helped build Puppeteer went on and now build Playwright instead. So it's very similar to Puppeteer, that you control the browser and it supports Chromium and Edge and Firefox as well, I think. So it's pretty nice. Lots of opportunities, and just something to be aware of, that there's many choices, but of course you can just stick to the defaults or what's easy to set up in your project. So here, let's look at an actual test. This is one of the tests from the Lumberjack library that Santosh and I are maintaining. It's a logging library for Angular. So let's look at the different parts in here. This whole block of code is called a test suite. It contains setup for the test, common variables, and it contains, in this case, I only listed one test case, and it has a test step and an assertion. So in the top, we see it has a test hook that is run before each of the test cases. So it sets up the initial state, and in Angular tests, it usually sets up the modules for testing, as we can see here, using the test bed, which is an Angular API. And we also set up like test doubles, like we see here, there's a spy log driver. So that replaces an actual driver, and we can inspect it in the test to see if the code did what we expect it to do, so that we can verify it automatically. So this is a real test from Lumberjack, and now you've seen the different pieces of what makes up a test. And end-to-end test can look very similar to this. It just the difference is mainly in like what's the scope, at what level of abstraction are you writing the test. Like here is very detailed on a very, very granular level. We're testing a single service or a few services that work together. And end-to-end test, we'll get into that later, but it has a larger scope. It tests a bigger part of your test base at the same time with a single test. So this is the test case again, but this test follows the arrange, act, and assert pattern that's widely recognized and used. So in the arrange section, we will set up our initial state and configure any test doubles like spies and marks and stops. Then in the second section, let me just turn off my phone here. Then in the second section, we have the act, and that's where we exercise the code that we're testing when it comes to a unit test. So we're testing this logger service. So we call a log method and pass it some of the parameters we have prepared. And then in the third phase, which is assert, we run assertions and expectations. And here we are checking that the log driver has a method called log critical that was called when we called logger.log. It was called to produce a side effect, and it was called with the parameters that we expected it to pass on to that log driver. So that's the basic structure of a test, and it's a good structure to follow. And it can also help you decide whether you are testing too much in a single test. If you break it down into these groups, it's a good pattern to follow. There's a similar pattern here called given when then. It's basically the same, but it's usually used with when you're doing what's called behavior-driven development, where you often use the Gherkin files that has the syntax. It's a text file that has the syntax of given when then. And given is always like what's the background or again what's the initial state before we're exercising the code base here. So it's like arrange. We're setting up the environment and the state, and then we do our thing. That's the when section, which was called act before, but it can be exactly the same thing. But yeah, in the behavior-driven development, it's about what event happens or what change in state happens, and finally we have the then, and that is so the when part happened. What's the outcome? Like what can we see now in our environment that's different from before? What are we expecting to see? So either follow the arrange, act, assert, or the given when then pattern. It will help you structure your tests. So in terms of that was the general testing knowledge. What do you need to know to test Angular applications and libraries? There's these three main topics that are pretty important: the different types of Angular tests, the Angular specific tests, and learn how to use the platform. That's the testing APIs that Angular has out of the box. So first, let's look at the types of Angular tests here. We have unit tests, We also have what's called snapshot tests. It takes a serialized state and saves it, and the next time you run the test, that state, like it could be the DOM output, like the HTML produced by your component. It could save that in a file, just has it built in, for example, but there's also other libraries with that capability. It'll compare your DOM structure, the HTML, the next time you run the test, and if something changed, you have to decide, was this intentional? Because then you have to update your snapshots. And if it's unintentional, well, you did a breaking change. And now you have to figure out why. So a snapshot test is a way to pretty easily cover a lot of code that can be serialized, such as some JavaScript objects or HTML or XML or anything like that. It's not really specific to Angular, but it is one of the types of tests we sometimes see when testing Angular. The next ones are very specific to Angular. They are component tests. There's 3 different types. We have the isolated component test, the shallow component test, and the integrated component test. And we'll try to visualize the difference in a moment. We also sometimes use visual regression tests. It's similar to snapshot testing, but it uses screenshots. So it will render your components and it will take a screenshot of what it looks like. And then it'll compare it the next time. It'll store that screenshot and it'll compare it the next time, similar to the snapshot test. So we have the same situation. If something changed, you have to decide, was it intentional? Then you save the new screenshot. If it wasn't intentional, what triggered this change, right? So, yeah. Finally, we have the integration tests. They're not specific to Angular, but that's about testing. Usually it's about testing several classes together, where the unit test is isolated and usually focusing on just a single class or a single function or anything like that. The integration test can test 2 or more classes, often in Angular, together in the same test to see what do they work as expected when you combine them. It could even be a whole Angular feature module. You're testing everything inside of that module in a single test suite.
Okay. So there is,
yeah.
I think we are going to so actually Torsten, if I'm not wrong, I'm sure I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but he asked the question, what are the which tools you actually prefer for visual regression testing? I think we are going to discuss that in upcoming slides. Yeah, just to let him know.
Test. No, and this is Thorstein. He's actually a colleague of mine. I don't have any preferences or any recommendations for visual regression tests. I think there's something called apply tools that can be combined with Storybook, if I recall correctly, and built by the same team, I think. Could be wrong on that, but yeah. Yes, so the final type of test is end-to-end tests. And that's, we'll look at the scope of that. It's basically you test almost your whole application, maybe even your backend in a single test suite. And as we can see here in the image, the money bags are how expensive they are to maintain and develop. And the tortoise and the rabbit are like how fast are they to run. And you can say what you want, it still holds up to this day. So of course, it's also about like what gives you the most value. End-to-end tests can cover a large amount of the code base at the same time and see if is something wrong. But the unit tests and component tests and integration tests can give a better idea about what is actually wrong. The end-to-end test will usually just tell you something is wrong, but not what is wrong. Like where is it in the code base? So it's about the scope of the test. How granular is it? How many things are testing at the same time? And believe me, if you were to write test cases in end-to-end testing frameworks for the same amount of different states that we test with unit tests, it would be a nightmare. Even no matter how comfortable you are with Cypress or Protractor or whatever, it's simply not like it's not doable. It's not worth doing either. And well, the thing is, you do both, or you do all of them. So it's about what should I focus on in unit test, what should I focus on in component test, what should I focus on in integration test, and what should I focus on in the end-to-end test. And this pyramid, the testing pyramid, the blue one is a classical example. It's not considered very valid anymore, but it used to say that you should have very few end-to-end tests, more integration tests, and the most unit tests. And you can choose to do that, or you can do any other variation of it. Like maybe you want to do lesser unit test and more integration test, or the most end-to-end test. Of course, just do what you're comfortable with, but know that it comes at a cost, both in maintenance and especially in how fast are they to execute. Like just starting up the end-to-end testing framework is a lot slower than starting up a unit testing framework. Does this make sense, Santosh?
Yeah, good.
Okay, so my keyboard doesn't work. Here we go. So this is the scope of an end-to-end test. As you can see here, we're testing the DOM, the HTML in the browser. We're also testing two components and two services, the Heroes Presenter and the Hero Service. And we're even hitting the backend with this end-to-end test. That's one form of end-to-end test. Another form of end-to-end test is you leave out the backend and you stub it. You can use, for example, mock service worker to return fake HTTP calls instead of responses from the actual backend. But now you're not testing your application with your backend, so you could have some issues there once they run in production together. Unless you're very good at, you have some way of synchronizing the APIs from the backend to the front end. That's also possible with some tooling. But yeah, there's different types of end-to-end tests as well. So here we see an isolated component test. We're actually testing this as just a class because it's a container component. So we're not really interested in testing its actual DOM. So we're creating an instance of this container component and testing it like any other service or simple class, how we would do that with a unit test. But it's still a component. It's just called an isolated component test. We have another type of component test. That's the shallow component test. That's where we include the DOM and any services that are scoped to this component. In this case, a presenter service. So we actually render this component in isolation using the test bed, and we can interact with it using the DOM. Like we can click buttons and what else it has in its template. But we're only rendering this one component. If it has any child components, and most of them or all of them will be stubbed out, so they won't render anything. We'll just make sure that the test bed can compile them, and they don't give us errors. But that's a shallow component test. You can also do an integrated component test. So now we actually have two components being rendered: the container component and the Heroes presentational component in this example. So that's an integrated component test where you render child components as well. You don't have to render all of them, but you include more than just the one component for sure. And this is an example of an integration test. So now we include the actual hero service instead of replacing it with a spy. We use the actual service, but we use a fake backend, for example. So now we have an integration test, which looks similar to the end-to-end test with a stop backend. But here we're not using an end-to-end testing framework. We're using an unit or integration testing framework for this. So the tooling is different. The utilities, the possibilities, the configuration we can do is different. So it can have other benefits. Of course, we can also do just a traditional unit test.
Unit.
Yeah, and that's usually it's good for testing services like this hero service or even the heroes presenter service because it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't or it shouldn't depend on the DOM or even Angular itself, except for maybe dependency injection. Yeah. Next thing is what tests are specific to Angular. Like if I
Mm-hmm.
was a React developer, came into Angular, what did I have to learn in addition, even if I already knew how to do automated testing?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you need to learn how to test services because Angular uses dependency injection. So for that, you should use the test bed that we'll explore later.
Mm-hmm.
But you should also use that for testing providers. That's another part of the dependency injection system in Angular. And the same with the injection tokens. They are also representing dependencies, for example, browser APIs, so that you can replace them with fake APIs in the test.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, we have some special classes here in Angular, the application hooks. That's the application initializers and the bootstrap listeners. And they're actually pretty hard to test, but I'll share a secret solution for it later. Even for Angular modules, there's different ways of testing them depending on the type of module, and there's many types of Angular modules, even more than we see here, but those are some of the more important ones. We have a feature module, which can be routed and usually includes many components and many routes. We have a service module, which is about setting up providers and dependencies,
Mm-hmm.
and they are tested in a different way. We have UI modules that are full of declarables like pipes, presentational components, and directives, and they can be tested in a different way. And finally, we have the shell modules or the feature shell modules, depending on the pattern you're using. They have yet another way of being tested. So there's many Angular-specific things you need to learn to test all of this. You don't have to
Mm-hmm.
learn all of it at once, but just be aware that there's many special classes and things in Angular, and they are tested in different ways. There's even more, as we can see here. There's Angular pipes have to be tested, and yeah, there's even different ways to test them, and I'll share the best way I know later. There's
Mm-hmm.
Angular directives. There's even two types of Angular directives. There's the attribute directives and the structural directives, and each is tested and used in a different way. Even when it comes to components, they're not tested in the same way. Like there's presentational components, they're tested in one way, or there's multiple ways to test them. There's container components.
Mm-hmm.
They shouldn't rely on the DOM, so should be able to test them without calling compile component on the test bed. We have mixed components. That's something that should be split into a presentational and a container component, in my opinion. But a lot of people are still using mixed components. But now you need a combination of both the presentational and the container component techniques. Let me just finish the last bullets here. We also have routed components and routing
Mm-hmm.
components, and they need special tooling as well to test them. Did you have a comment or question?
There was one for unit testing. How to test private function. I think that's the question which gets asked a lot.
Okay. How to test a private method or a function that's not exposed in a ES
Yeah.
module. We'll actually get into that later, but in general, don't do that. Like maybe you have, if you're getting into this issue, you probably have a design problem. There's a better design for your class or your functions or whatever. It shouldn't be testing implementation details.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is not even the end of the list. Here's some more.
Ah.
We have 4 different route guards, and we have
Mm-hmm.
route resolvers. So as we can see, there's like, I don't know, 25 different things you need to learn. Each is tested in one of several ways. So probably 75 different testing techniques you need to learn to be Angular testing guru. So, but like, just be aware, this is your roadmap for what you could learn eventually.
Mm-hmm.
and start with the things you need.
Okay.
So learn to use the platform, like what's
Mm-hmm.
provided by Angular. There's the test bed, and that's useful for testing dependencies such as services and injection tokens and providers and provided values. It's also useful for most types of components, directives, Angular pipes, and all of the Angular modules. So let's look at what that looks like for component tests.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what we should see in a component test is we have some source of change, and we have a target of the change. It can be the URL or user navigation. It can be the DOM,
Mm-hmm.
or it can be the data binding API of a component. That's the input and output properties. Or it could be a service, which the component depends on. So the change can come from the service, or it can go to the service and the other parts as well. So the typical structure of a component test looks like these 5 steps. We configure the Angular testing module. We create the component fixture from the test bed. Then we set up the test doubles, so the spies and the stubs and the mocks and the fakes. And we set up the initial state of this test environment. And all of those are the arrange part, or the test hook and the arrange part, if you remember from earlier. And the fourth part here is trigger some change from the source. So, for example, you could click the button. You can do that with the test bed, or you can update an observable from a service it depends on, or you can
Mm-hmm.
update an input property the component has, or you could update a URL using the router,
Mm-hmm.
for example. So that's the source of the change. You trigger that. That's the act part, and the final part is the assert part. So we assert on the change target. So did the URL change as expected? Did we navigate to a different route as we expected? Did the DOM change? Does it display the new loaded array that we got from the service? Um, did it output anything from its output properties, an Angular custom event, or did it update something through a service method? So that's the general structure of a component test. And now we
Mm-hmm.
have an actual example here from the Angular IO testing documentation.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so there's a lot of import statements at the top. I just left them here for completeness sake. But I have highlighted some lines of code here. Number 1, configure the Angular testing module. That's this testbed configure testing module. The testbed is, we have to use that for component testing, or we need some other framework for it. And number 2 is create the component fixture. And then number 3, we set up the test doubles. The fourth one is we trigger the change from the source. And in this case, it's, let's see. Yeah, in this case, it's just Angular runs the on init hook when we run auto detect changes, which is running change detection on the component fixture. And this is where some of the magic of Angular starts to show, like the black magic of Angular, change detection, the excessive dirty checking. Because in tests, even with this auto detect changes set to true,
Mm-hmm.
you'll find that you often have to call fixture.detect changes yourself, because you're doing the change detection. Angular is not doing it itself, because
Mm-hmm.
it's in production code, Angular will do this for you. But now in the tests, it starts to becoming clear, like Angular is doing a lot of magic when things happens, and that's due to the ng zone using zone.js. In the test, you have to be Angular. You have to run the change detection whenever you have changed the state. Sometimes it can be caught automatically by this auto detect changes, but not all of the time, unfortunately. So we trigger the change. It's just the ng on the init hook is called, and that triggers some service to load some heroes. In this example, it's the heroes tutorial from Two of Heroes, right? So in the end, in the test case, in the bottom, number 5, we can see that we assert on the change target. And so the source of the change wasn't a service, a hero service. We can't really see it here.
Mm-hmm.
but it's except it's the hero service spy we have. So that was the source of the change, and the target of the change is the DOM. Well, we queried the DOM as we see in the second to last line of code: fixture debug element query all by CSS dashboard hero. And we noticed that now we have, or we verified that we now have 4 heroes, because the 4 heroes were loaded and the component did its job. It's now displaying it to the DOM, presenting it to the user. So this is a typical structure for component tests. Another API you need to learn to use at some point, this is an advanced one, but the router testing module can be used for feature modules, routed components, routing components, route guards, and route resolvers. And I'll show you an example here. Also from Angular.io, there's a routing tutorial, I think, or is it the testing tutorial? Is one of those. They are also based on 2 of heroes, but add some more features on top of it. Yeah. So the first thing we have to notice here is we're importing the router testing module from the Angular router testing namespace. And in the second pointing finger, we see we're inside of the testbed configure testing module. We're adding the router testing module to the imports, and we're loading an array of routes set up specifically for this test. The first route is a hero detail component, and we're replacing that with a test component, but we're making that hero's ID route active inside of this test. That's because we're testing a routing component. A routing component will navigate to some other route when something happens. So we need to have a target component for that route. That's what we're setting up here. In the second import line inside of the with routes. Or I should have some more partners here, sorry. What I was saying before, the test hero detail component, it's just a component I set up for this test. I'm registering its route with the router testing module. I'm also adding it to the declarations of the testing module that we're configuring. I also have to set up an app component, and it can be anything, but it has to have this router outlet. So that will be the root component for this test. And normally with component tests, most of them, your component you're testing will be the root component, which is kind of strange because it's like creating an app just with that one component. Of course, when we have several routes, we have to have the root component just like in a real app, and then we have to have the routes that we're seeing. So now we have loaded the dashboard module, which has routes itself, and we're injecting this location service from Angular because we need to test the URL we're ending up on when we see the test. So we need this location service from Angular itself. And this is also part of setup when we're testing a whole feature using the router testing module. So we're testing the whole dashboard module actually. In this one test we'll be looking at here, we're just testing one of the components, but we can test every component in the dashboard module using this technique. So we're navigating to the dashboard feature. I think in the actual code there is only one component, a dashboard component, but the technique can be used no matter how many components are in that feature module. So we're also running. It's a bit special here. It's one of the techniques we're getting into the advanced here. The router testing module is advanced. It's for the more advanced tests, the component integration tests across routes. So we have to run this navigate by URL from the router inside of the ng zone of this root fixture. And then we have to set up auto detect changes, true triggers the first change detection. So it navigates to the dashboard components, and then it runs the ng-init hooks and so on, so that its data will be loaded. So this is all configuration of the test module. It's done in this before each test hook. Sorry if it's a lot to take in, but Angular testing is, yeah, it's an acquired taste. Like there's a lot you need to learn, but it's because it's because of some design choices in Angular. Angular is actually built around this dependency injection, which means that you can replace the different parts for tests, and this is nice, but you also have to do it the Angular way, and there can be a lot of like special code just to make Angular happy, as we're seeing here. So next we see the actual test case here. So we have this root fixture, which is our test app component. So that's our application component for this test. And we're querying root fixture debug element query. And the first, the hero debugger, we're asking for a dashboard hero component that's visible at the current route. And in the second one, we're asking for a CSS selector .hero, so an element with the hero class on it. So we're looking up these two things because we need them for later. The next step here is we call the click. This is a native event we're calling on the hero HTML element. And because we're using the native event, we don't have to run change detection because we set up the auto detect changes. But in many cases, you have to call root fixture detect changes. But this is one of the exceptions for that. So this is our act part. This is what we want to test. When we click a hero element, and what should happen then, that's what we find out now. We should end up at the heroes route. So it'll be /heroes / the ID of that hero we clicked on. So this was a very advanced Angular test, and I spent probably half a year figuring out how the router testing module works, because it's one of the things that's barely mentioned in documentation. I have these 3 articles for now. How to test routing components with the router testing module. You can also test them without the router testing module. I'll also show you how to do that and compare the different approaches. How to test the routed Angular components with and without the router testing module, and how to test the Angular route guards with and without the router testing module. So you can find this on This is Angular on the dev community, dev.to. That's my publication. And I also have a article series on testing and faking Angular dependencies. You can find that on Angular in-depth or indepth.dev, sorry. So yeah, before this, I think this might be a good time for a 5-minute break or something. What do you think?
Yes, I think we are already 45 minutes, around 45 minutes. So let's take a small break. And meanwhile, I'll just let you know the story behind this routing module, right? So I remember I was actually, I'm not good at testing, so I'll not lie. So if you ask me any Angular related question, probably I will just redirect you to someone else. So I was just learning about this routing, and I kept getting routed component, kept getting this error that your application is actually running outside of zone. And I was like, okay, I tried to figure it out, and I then left it as it is. And last year, actually, Lars wrote this article, and then I figured out, okay, this is just one line change, which you might have actually seen in his code, zone.run. That was the solution. And I couldn't find it anywhere. So, I mean, of course, Angular testing is something which you have to spend a lot of time figuring out how to fix it.
For sure. Yeah. There's like it's very powerful, but it's also similar to Angular. There's just so much to learn, right? And unfortunately, it's lagging in some places in the documentation. That's why we write the articles to so that we have some documentation of it. So yeah, and on top of that, I developed a testing library to do some of this work for you. That's spectacular. That we'll look at later.
Cool. So let's take a break. And meanwhile, I've just shared the link for dev.to. This is Angular, and you can just go ahead and read all the blog post here. And also, as I've recently found one workshop which was really helpful. I couldn't attend it because of the dates, but in case you are looking for some Angular testing workshop, Eunice runs a workshop. I think his next dates are in April. So in case you are free around April, I think you should join this workshop. It's really nice. And I have already actually registered for it, just waiting for this workshop to actually whenever he schedules it, so I can join it. Yep, let's go for a break now, and we'll be back within 5 minutes, and we'll continue with Angular testing strategy.
Yes, see you in 5 minutes.
Uh, Welcome, Eunice. I mean, I'm looking forward to that workshop. So yeah, but I received some good feedback from my colleagues, and yeah, thanks a lot. So we are on short break. In case you have any questions, you can post it while Lars comes back, and we start discussing about it. But in case, let me just take this up time to actually let you know about the next episodes. So in next week, we are going to have two episodes, one on Friday and one on Monday. So on Monday, we are going to have the creator of ngXS library, who will be talking about ngXS with us. And on Friday, we are going to have another amazing session. I would say I'm looking forward to that session as well. It's with Sam Julian. I'm sure most of you know about Sam. So he's an DevRel manager. So recently promoted to DevRel manager at Auth Zero, and we will be of course talking about identity, right? So Auth is back.
Yeah, I think we're getting close to the 5 minutes point, right?
Yeah, actually, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we can start.
Is there any questions we should take now before we continue?
Right now, there is no questions in chat, but yep, recently when came in, Salim has this question. will there not be an direct impact in performance when component compilation happens before its spec? Okay.
Yeah. So as soon as you call the create component, or sorry, the compile component, um, yeah, Angular will look up every template, every every component template, every component model. It will compile everything, and same with the style sheets. And uh, if you have them in separate files, which a lot of us have, it will
Hmm.
actually take a bit longer than if you use just a single file component. Um, I don't know, like, what's the impact of this. Of course, it depends on how many tests you have and how many components you're testing at the same time. And you're asking, does it have a performance hit when it happens before each test case? Uh, yeah, it has some performance hit, but with Angular 9, it actually was the speed was improved significantly. Before then, I was actually recommending to test as few components as possible by using compile components. So you could actually leave out the DOM and test it like a
Hmm.
simple class instead to speed up your tests. There was this library called ng-bullet that would speed it up, but luckily the Angular team they addressed this most of this performance issue in Angular 9. It had been a problem since version 2, so it took a while, but yeah, it was a big speed improvements, and I even think they added some more optimizations in version 10 or yeah, probably version 10. So they're caching a lot of these compiled modules and their metadata, and I think it's primarily possible because we're now using Ivy. So if you're still stuck on the Vue engine, tough luck. Upgrade. You should upgrade to Ivy.
Yep, I think he's saying he's also using ng-bullet.
Mm,
I think yeah, but as Lars said, right, you can actually remove it in case you are on heavy and
yeah,
just use the native one. Cool. So I think
sure.
this is the only question we had, Lars. We can actually move
Okay.
on.
Yeah, I see there's a lot of activity in the chat. I can't really keep up while presenting. But I hope you'll take note if there's any questions and try to
Yeah,
take
sure. I'm doing the
another
same.
make room for another question because
Yeah,
there's
sure.
more sections to this presentation. Okay, you can still see my presentation, right?
Yes, we are.
Good. So now we're getting into Angular testing strategies, and this is based on a question from Vimal
Vimal.
Patel. Vimal, okay.
Yeah, he's Vimal Patel.
Okay, you know him.
Yes, because he is helping with a lot of projects, a lot of open source projects which I had, and he's really doing great. I think an upcoming star, I would say. So he is doing a lot of, and he wants actually reached out to me this year, and he said, Santosh, I want to do some open source contribution,
Oh,
and let's see how we can do it. And I was like, okay, let's do that, and that's how I actually started the Discord server, and then I started that Discord server, and we continuously speak to each other what is going on in case something needs to be done. I'm not that much active, but yes, I try to help him as much as I can. But yes, he is doing great so far.
yeah, I think I've seen him in your Discord server. So
Yeah.
hi, Vimal. I'll try to answer your question here. What are the advantages? Or sorry, you could read this, Santosh.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so Vimal had this question, advantage of unit test compared to integration test. In other words, how to choose which functionality we should cover in unit test and which one is should be in integration test. Yeah, Vimal is online.
Oh, hi, Vimal. So this question and the next one is what I have based this section on, like the testing strategy for Angular. So there's another question here related by Ajit.
Yeah, so Ajit, I'm not sure if you know Ajit, but he's one of the Angular collaborator. So he joined as an Angular collaborator last year, 2020, and an amazing guy. I actually met him once, but we didn't knew each other. Actually, we met at conference, and he actually sent me a message that I saw you at this conference. I was like, why didn't you approach me? He was like, I thought you will not recognize me. I was like, bloody hell! I mean, I wanted to meet you from a long time, and you came in front of me and said, okay. But yeah, he's a great guy. He's doing a lot of PRs for Angular, and as a collaborator, he is working on few features and uh, the internal issues which Angular has. So he has this question: how to manage tests and some examples of how you manage them, principles you follow while writing tests.
Yeah. So hi Ajit. I also know Ajit from the in-depth community. We had a bunch of these author talks.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, he didn't have the turban in those meetings, and it was COVID time, so it was a bit more cozy than this picture. But yeah, he's a nice guy. So thank you for the questions here. What are the principles I'm following while writing tests, and how do I manage my tests and examples of that? So this leads into we saw the testing pyramid before, like how do we balance uh, our tests, like how many end-to-end tests, how many integration tests, component tests, unit tests.
Mhm.
So like that's what we should figure out and define as our testing strategy, what we test and how we
Mhm.
test it. So let's look at this example. I hope it's a bit of an animation. I hope it's okay for the stream.
Yeah,
So
it's visible.
this is an example of course, someone clicking a button, and then an event is trickles all the way up. It looks down here, but it's actually up the component tree and the
Mhm.
service dependencies. So we start with an event, a click event in the browser, goes through a presentational component into a presenter service, and then back to the presentation component. It's output um, from an output property, which the container component subscribes to, and then it updates something in its service. So this is a very generic pattern, but a very common one, right? So how would we test that? Do you have a suggestion, Santosh?
As I said, I mean, if you're going to ask me a question related to testing, I will just uh, send you to someone else, probably you.
Okay. Well, yeah, there's more examples, but maybe someone in the chat can have a suggestion. But what I'm trying to say here, there's a lot of like there's many classes here.
Yeah.
So we can either, as we saw before, we can have scoped. We can have a scope test for the presenter. We can have like an isolated test for the service. We can have an
Mhm.
isolated component test for the container component. We can have a shallow component test for the presentational component and the DOM and the presenter.
Mhm.
We can have an integrated component test for the container component, the presentational component, the presenter, and the DOM. Or we can have an integration test that also includes the service. And of course,
Mhm.
we can even have and more of an end-to-end test, which may or may not include the backend as well. Um, we can also have all of them. Like we can have unit tests,
Mhm.
and we can test like real. We can really unit tests are great for verifying your assumptions about what your component does and what it's supposed to do, because we all make silly mistakes, and it's very bad if they end up in production. And end test will not uh, they will not catch all of them, because you're simply not uh, you're not exercising the application in all its different states. And if you are, you're spending a lot of time on writing end-to-end tests, because there's thousands of combinations of state that your app will
Mhm.
go through once you have a huge user base. The unit tests are great for putting your component in, especially an edge case situation, um, something that might not happen very often,
Mhm.
but by testing all of the behavior of your component, that's a lot easier when the scope is smaller. So it's a lot easier in a unit test, focusing on one class, or component test, which is focusing on the DOM, the component, and maybe its presenter service, for example. But it's a trade-off. Like you should do what makes sense for your team. Of course, it also depends on your experience as a team. How
Mhm.
much experience do you have with end-to-end tests, unit tests, integration tests, tests at all, or are you doing manual tests, which is bad? So, and here's another example. That's the data flow in the other direction. Before it was actually an event flow, and now we're
Mhm.
seeing a data flow. So that button was clicked, and now we have navigated to another component, and now we're listing heroes or whatever orders, and the data trickles down from the service down the component tree into the DOM, and we can test that like before. We have many different options, and what we choose will depend on our team and the project and our experience level. But we have
Mm-hmm.
many different options for which tests to write, and how many unit tests, how many integration tests, how many end-to-end tests, if at all. And here we see a more complex UI feature. It's a table component that's made up of many different components,
Mm-hmm.
and each one of those can have its own presenter instance. So again, like, we have many classes, and there's different ways to choose to test them. We can test each class in isolation, can test a few together, or we can test all of them together, or we can even boot up the whole application and enter some text in that user input and see if an HTTP request is made when we click the save button or something like that. Yeah. So here's another example from the Tour of Hero
Mm-hmm.
tutorial. This is from one of my articles. I tried to visualize like the flow, the control flow. So when the user clicks the delete button, first we hit the presentational heroes component. It has a remove output property that calls the delete method on the heroes container component, and that calls the delete hero method on the hero service. And then it actually goes to the server. It comes back. It forwards that new heroes array
Mm-hmm.
or the observable of a heroes array to the container component, and then to the presentational component through its input property, and then it gets rendered to the DOM. Or maybe we have optimistic um, optimistic updates where it gets deleted straight away from the user's point of view, but if there's a server error, it will be added to the list again. So again, we see many different classes working together, and we can test each one in isolation, or we can test them together, or we can go for an end-to-end test and click the button, see if the server is called, see if
Mm-hmm.
the list item disappears and keeps being disappeared. And just another example here, we're adding a hero, and we also have a presenter service in this case. So there's
Mm-hmm.
one more class to the collection, but it's kind of the same control flow. So how do we test this? This is what we need to figure out to create our testing strategy. We want to test every single class with a unit test. We want to test like, we want to test everything that's visible here in an integration test, or maybe an integrated component test, or maybe we just want unit test for the services and the container component, and we're happy with adding an end-to-end test on top of that for clicking the button and what
Mm-hmm.
happens if the server errors and so on. Like, where would we want to test that? Would we test that in the end-to-end test or in the integrated component test? Maybe that's the decisions we have to make as a team, and we should preferably we should document it in some team wiki or anything like that. Like, what's our testing strategy? So now we're actually moving on to the next topic here, to protractor. Oh, sorry. This is from C. Kettenbach, and you can read this one, Santosh.
Yeah, to Protector or to Cypress? That is the question. I think there were many questions related to this.
Yeah. And there's one more from Vemma.
Women, yeah. Which one to choose, Cypress or Protector? And I think there is in chat one. So I tend to prefer isolated test and let my Cypress test handle DOM related scenarios. Is it a good strategy? So
Yeah,
again, related to Protector
yeah.
or
That is
Cypress.
so that's your testing strategy. That's completely
Mm-hmm.
fine. That makes sense to you, and it gives you good test coverage and good confidence that it will work in production. That's good. Like, uh, just the fact that you're using automated tests at all is good. A few years ago, it wasn't that normal. I believe it's become a lot more normal these past 3 or 4 years. But there are still companies not doing a lot of automated testing. Like, they can even have many people employed only to do manual tests. So, yeah. So, which one to choose, Cypress or Protractor? That's the question. So again, I'll just like to recap that those are not the only two options. There's many different options. It just
Mm-hmm.
happens that Angular CLI comes with the protractor builder out of the box and the
Mm-hmm.
configuration, and you can pretty easily add Cypress as well. But if you see some benefit in trying out the other frameworks, you can also add them to your Angular CLI setup. Well, in that case, I would recommend using NX. It has the run
Mm-hmm.
command builder, which makes it pretty easy to do a simple integration of another tool chain, like another end-to-end testing framework. But which one between those two? Because, and this is my personal opinion and based on my personal experience, I don't have a lot of experience with Cypress. We just started using it in a new project at work. But from my point of view, based on what I do know and have picked up on the internet and in the community. One of the pros is it has a big community because it's not only about Angular. It's in active development by a company currently focusing on this product. Cypress was recently bought for something like 40 or 60 millions or got a huge investment or something like that. So what happens in the future, we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it won't be the Cypress company. Maybe they will be merged into some bigger company. And will they
Mm-hmm.
continue to drive this product and focus on it? We'll see. It's definitely a risk, but it is a pro that they have. It's currently in active development by a company focusing on this product alone. So the cons, from what I've seen, um, the Cypress assertion style is an acquired taste. It's very different. It's based on magic strings, so it relies heavily on uh, types, string types, which is just very weird and it's difficult to remember all of them. It doesn't have support for Internet Explorer, Microsoft Edge Legacy, or macOS Safari.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to test across browsers with any of those, you're out of luck. It's not an option. It doesn't focus on Angular support, so the benefit is it has a big community. It's not focusing on Angular, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also a con. It's a downside to Cypress because there's some issues. There's various issues related to testing Angular components. It doesn't have a clean harness environment for Angular CDK. I know
Mm-hmm.
Eunice has built one, but it's very different from using it with Protractor. So maybe the CDK component test harness environment need to be redesigned, or Cypress needs to step up and make a better
Mm-hmm.
implementation with Eunice. Angular component tests are not fully supported yet. They have added like component testing as a feature, but they have focused on React, not Angular for that, as far as I'm aware. So there's not big focus on Angular because it supports other frameworks like React and Vue and everything else as well. So about Protractor, the benefits of Protractor, it's owned by the Angular team. It's heavily used by Google. It does support legacy browsers, so Internet Explorer, Microsoft Edge Legacy. It even supports macOS Safari. So if that's something you need, reach for Protractor. There's some big downsides of Protractor as well. It has barely been maintained for years. The Angular team took it over. It was within, well, was it last year or the year before that?
2019, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, 2019, and it's barely been touched since. And even before that, it was left in a horrible state for years. It's a generation, at least one generation behind on Selenium support.
Yep.
And even the Angular team is considering other alternatives going forward. So the future is still uncertain, and it's certainly not a well maintained or up to date product. So those are the downsides.
Yeah, I think they got some minor release last, I think around Angular 10 or something.
Yeah,
But yeah.
it skipped the version 6, which was never stable, and it skipped to version 7. But yeah, it
Yeah.
was just they removed some legacy APIs or something to fix Google's own internal CI.
Mhm.
That's the only reason
Uh,
they did that. Yeah. So the next one is some special testing techniques, and yeah, see, this is going to be a long session because we're at slide 55 out of 105.
Yeah.
So
So if
I
you
feel
don't
sorry
mind,
for you, Santosh. It's late.
uh, I know it's okay. As I said, I mean, I have a lot of time. Let's take some questions. If not, if we can. So they are related to end-to-end. So Vijay has this question: what is the best way to measure coverage for E2E tests?
Yeah. So this is the notion of test coverage or code coverage, and your testing framework should be able to record which classes or which parts of your code base are being run as you run your tests. And this is true for unit test, integration test, and the end-to-end test. Well, any type of test we've seen basically, except for snapshot and visual regression tests. So you need your testing framework to be able to output some reports.
Mhm,
It could be Kubertura reports. It could be JUnit XML reports, or is that for test reports? Yeah, there's a few test coverage formats.
mhm,
Um, so your testing framework or some plugin needs to be able to output that, and you need to um, yeah, need some tooling to give you like either it should analyze, is this below your threshold? What's your limit? Like which coverage do you want? Do you want 60%, 80% test coverage, 85, 95, 100? So either you have some command line tool that can look at the reports and say, you have 80% test coverage, and that's enough. Or you could upload it to, for example, Sona Cloud, the report, and then it knows your code base. So it will actually give you a visual report of which parts of the code um, are not being covered, right? So no
mhm,
matter what testing framework you're using, that's the one that should be able to output these reports, or someone would have to write a plugin to do that.
mhm.
Yeah.
So there is another question from Mahmood. So specifically to the scenario, I mean, the first scenario which we saw, right, where we clicked on a button and then, so his question is that is there any real value for integration test beyond unit test?
Yeah. So, like testing everything in a single test, is there any real value? It's
Mhm,
less of a, it's less, it has less benefit now than that it used to have, since we got all the strict templates, and
mhm,
Ivy added some more stricter types, stronger typing for templates. So now our editor and even the compiler will be able to pick up on more typos and type errors. The types of the Angular pipes, the built-in common pipes, are being have been become more strict. But you need to enable this, of course, in your TS config, the compiler options strict true, and the Angular compiler options strict templates true, and so on. If you have all of that, there's less benefit to it. But then increase the scope so that you're testing more than just these two related components. So you're testing a
mhm,
whole user story or a whole user flow through many components and many routes. You can do that with end-to-end tests, but you can also do it with integration tests on the test bed. You just need to
mhm.
learn how to configure the test bed. Yeah,
Cool.
but there's less value in it than what it used to be. That's right.
I think Unis has the support harness redesign in Cypress unique
Yeah,
100%. So yeah,
yeah.
so he agrees.
Eunice has opened an issue with the Angular
Uh-huh.
repo about um, reconsidering some design decisions on the Angular CDK component harness.
Oh, okay, cool. I think yeah, that's it. Those were the questions we had. Now we can move.
Okay, so now it's some specific testing techniques based on questions from the community. And again, we have Ajit. Will
Mhm.
you read?
Yep. So Ajit has this question: how to write tests while keeping method extensions in mind? Methods can be extended and their inside workings can be changed. Should we write test best only on the written statement, or should we test the intermediate steps too?
Yeah. So this is related a bit to the question from earlier. should we test, or how do we test private methods and functions that are not exported and so on? And
Mm-hmm.
these are my suggestions, and I'll show you a real example as well. So in general,
Mm-hmm.
only test implementation details in case of any side effects. So that is if we have some commands or state updates sent to collaborators, which are, for example, service dependencies. Those are known as collaborators in tests. Instead, you should focus on. So this is about classes that are meant to be base classes, classes you extend.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, you should focus on verifying the inheritance and the polymorphism APIs of that class. And we'll look at an actual example here from, again, from Lumberjack, our Angular testing library.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a class here called Lumberjack Logger, and it's even marked as an abstract class because it's only intended to be used as a base class for other classes. And it looks a bit confusing here because of all the types, but you'll be happy with the strong typing when you're using the library. It's just it's a bit messy to for us as maintainers, but you won't notice when using the library. It'll be
Mm-hmm.
an enjoyable experience for you. Lumberjack has 6 different logging levels. And that's because of that we have 6 different methods and one more method that's the generic one. We have one for the critical logging level, the debug logging level, error, info, trace, and warning logging level as well. So if you notice, there's not even a public method in here or even a public property. So how would you test that? You can't even test this. TypeScript will yell at you if you try to call any of these methods.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do? Well, in fact, we have another class here that extends. This is called the scoped lumberjack logger, and it extends the lumberjack logger. Um, it adds yet another. Well, it replaces the generic method from the lumberjack logger class. So it adds. If you could see the implementation, um, it adds this. You can see it has the abstract read-only scope string property. That means the class in your code that's extending the scope lumberjack logger will have to define a public read-only property with a string type called scope. And once you do that, it will add that scope to all the logs that are defined in this your class. So this class inherits from the lumberjack logger class. And now we'll see an example of how we're testing this scoped lumberjack logger class, because this one doesn't have a public property either. Well, it has the read on the scope property, but that's abstract. So you will have to define it in your own class.
Yeah.
So to test this, we create a test logger class that extends from this scoped lumberjack logger class. So it can use all the protected methods from the scope lumberjack logger and the lumberjack logger class that it also extends.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm trying out each method here. I'm adding the scope property because the scope lumberjack logger has an abstract property. So I have to define that property or TypeScript will yell at me. So now I'm trying out each one of these 6 different logging levels. It's just passing a message through that will be included in this log that will be produced when we call this class. This is even an example of parameterized logging methods. Basically, this is a bad pattern. If you're doing this, you're doing it wrong. You shouldn't be using the logger class. You can just use a lumberjack service directly. But it's just to test that they all work. So in a test, it's fine. So now let's look at the actual test for this one. We set up the different dependencies by importing the lumberjack module, and we have to replace this lumberjack time service with a fake time service, so we can control the timestamps inside of the lumberjack logs. So the logger variable I have highlighted here, um, we're asking the test bed. We're not calling compile components, and when you don't do that, it's actually pretty fast.
Mhm.
So it will create a new instance of this test logger and set up all of its dependencies, all the different services it needs. So you can see here in the highlighted line that I'm storing this logger in a variable that I can access from the test cases. And here we're just replacing the lumberjack service so that it doesn't trigger any side effects. But we can, it's replaced with a spy. This is Jest, but we have a similar thing in Jasmine. We also have the spies,
Mhm.
so that I can verify later that the proper method on the lumberjack service has been called with the log object that I expect. And if that's the case, what my base class has done its job correctly, and it represents what a user would be able to do. It would be able to use this protected method in its own defined method. Yeah, so these are a few of the test cases. I just left out the configuration part, and I put in here the variables that it can access from before, and the two of the test cases here.
Mhm.
So we put in a test message. That's our arrange part, except for the configuration of the test bed and so on we saw before, and setting up these spies and creating the instant. That's also part of our arrange step. And then we call logger. That's our test logger. We call the critical method. Pass it a
Mhm.
message, and then we assert that the lumberjack services log method spy was called one time, and it was called with a log that has the properties that we expect it to have. It has the test message. It also has the scope of the logger. The log factory is just a help class for creating logs, which is it's useful in tests and is even used some places in the code base as well. And you're free to use it as part of Lumberjack. It's in the public API. So the second test case is the same, but for a debug logger method. And of course, there's also test cases covering the other four levels. So this is
Mhm.
a real-world example of how you can test a class that's abstract or meant to be used as a base class. So focus on, you should create a class. You can create a class that extends this class, and then you test, does it do what it's supposed to do from the test logger we defined, and it does. So we're happy.
So Mahmood says, this is such a genius approach to testing. This would help me in designing more versatile tests. So thanks, Mahmood, for great feedback.
Thanks, Mahmoud. He's one of my friends, so he has to
Ah,
say that. But thank you. Yeah. Mahmoud is the author of Nawa, a Python-based full-stack framework for rapid
mhm.
application development. I did a podcast episode about it once, and it's
Mhm.
an open source project he made as part of his business. So yeah, he's a very, very good guy as well from the United Arab Emirates. Nice to see you, Mahmoud. The next question.
So next question is from Ajit. So when to break down a test into smaller tests? Great question.
Yes. So these are my principles or my guidelines that I'll share here with you. As a rule of thumb, one interaction per test case. So when you break it down, you group it into these arrange, act, and assert. You should have
Mhm.
one statement in the act section. You should also usually have one assertion per test case. So you call expect one time per test case. There are exceptions to the rules, of course. Sometimes you want to have two test steps. So you do one interaction, one assertion, you do one more interaction and another assertion because it makes sense sometimes. But as a rule of thumb, one interaction per test case, one assertion per test case. So follow the arrange act assert pattern. And as I mentioned earlier, if the test is doing too much, the subject under test, so the class or function you're testing, is probably also doing too much, or its design can be improved. So what you want is test cases that are clear and concise. So do create helper functions, even if it's just for one test suite, to remove some noise, so that the test cases themselves are very clear and to the point. And use this arrange act assert pattern that's well recognized, because then people can see, okay, this is the part where we set up the initial state, this is the part where we're actually doing something with the code, and then finally we are asserting on the public state of whatever the target of the change was. So yeah, just how do you break it down? You focus on these principles.
That's great. I have actually probably I have seen some last test cases, and that's why I'm scared to actually write test cases. Looks like
Why is that?
uh, I have to actually kill that fear and start writing test cases probably.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yes, as this guidelines are actually going to help me. Looks like.
Yeah. So yeah, you can. I created a testing framework for you for end-to-end testing our schematics in
Yeah.
Lumberjack. So now you're set up for success. You have examples to follow. You have the whole test set up, and that's halfway there.
Yeah. Cool.
The next question.
So Ajit has this question: which test to skip? Like, I don't expect people to write tests for presentational components. What other cases can we skip, or should we write tests for all components?
And there's a related question here from Jerome.
So Jerome has this question: I currently question unit testing on dumb components, relying tests to visual testing with Storybook and E2E testing. Any thoughts about that?
And even snapshot tests. Yeah.
No, and
So
snapshots.
so this triggers me, of course, because I'm all about presentational components and
Mhm.
splitting them up from like no mix components, split them into container components and presentational components, because then they each one of them is concerned with um, like horizontal layers of abstraction in your architecture, like data access or presentational logic or IO and other things, persistence or user interaction. And when you break the classes up, they will be focusing on just one or maybe two concerns, and they will ideally they will also be at the same level of abstraction, so that you don't have something a very narrow implementation detail in the same service where you're also doing something on a high abstraction level. But yeah, let's take a look at presentational components.
Mm-hmm.
So my first question is to you: is it really a presentation component? Because I wrote an article about presentational components with Angular, and it's a long one, and it's my definition of yeah, it is my definition of what's a presentational component. But yeah, is it really a presentational component? Like, it has to, in my opinion, it has to live up to all of these bullet points. It only it presents application state to the user, and um, changes to application states are triggered by user interaction.
Mm-hmm.
It uses the on-push change detection strategy. It has no dependencies except for presenters and content view children. It only receives changes from input properties and a DOM, not from a service, except for a presenter, because that deals with presentational logic and not application state, only local UI state. It has minimal logic in its component template. It has only simple logic in its component model, because complex presentational logic is extracted through presenters. So is it a presentational component? Usually it's not. It's a mixed component. But yeah, there's actually two types of presentational components. There are the use case specific presentational components. So that's the business components. So it's not really concerned about UI. Like, it's not a a button component.
Mhm.
It might have a button, but that button is there to trigger some state change or save the form or whatever. So they usually have a one-to-one relationship with a container component. So, and when they have that and follow these other design principles, um, they should only contain logic that's barely worth testing. Because
Mhm.
instead, any complex presentational logic it might have is extracted into presenter services, and those are easily tested because they don't depend on the DOM or even Angular. In addition, the presenters enable presentational logic to be reused or shared. And I have a long article about presenters as well. And since I wrote that, we now have two libraries that are really good at creating presenter services, and that's the component store library by NGRX and the RX Angular state library. The services they create can be used
Mhm.
to create presenters. If they are presenters, it'll be because they are only dealing with presentational logic such as local UI state and user interactions and forms and stuff like that. They can also be used for other purposes, but this is one of the good use cases for them is presenter services. So how do you test these use case specific presentational components? Well, when the presentational components have very minimal complexity, we can rely on the static analysis, the integration test, and end-to-end test to catch simple mistakes such as typos, uh, type errors, or mapping errors. That's what we're discussing. What's the value in tests, and that goes down to even like, would you component test a presentation component? Maybe not if it's a use case specific presentation component, but you would test its presenter, and you would test a use case specific container component, and maybe you would include it in the test if you have an integration test or an end-to-end test, or even both.
Mhm.
So when we do test them, we can use fake container components to test the use case specific presentational components, because the container components with fake data will provide realistic but static data to presentational component, and so we can pull it out from the app and just focus on what does it look like and what does it do with this state, this set of data it gets, because it is tied to the application state when it's a use case specific presentational component. The other type of presentational components is a dynamic presentation component. Well, there's even three types, generally three types of presentation components. This is the second one, dynamic presentational components. So the data binding APIs of dynamic presentation components, they're usually not concerned about the application state. No, their most important traits or features are content projection or dynamic rendering using component outlets, template outlets, Angular CDK portals, or just simple content projection with ng content and select.
Mhm.
So that's dynamic presentation component. It's about similar to structural directives. It's about setting up the DOM using templates or other components. And they can also be tested in a specific way. They're really good. The tests for these presentation components are really good for documenting the data binding API, which is the interesting part of these components. So when you're doing that, you use a host component to verify the expected behavior. So when you call test-bed create component, you won't pass the name of the dynamic presentation component. You will have a component defined only for that test. That component will be above your dynamic presentation component in the
Mhm.
component tree in this test. So you will pass it input properties for component like the things we saw before, like template outlets, component outlets, and portals. All of that. You would do that using your usually using a host component or a special service. Yeah. The final category of presentational components is reusable presentational components. And common examples of these are what's known as atoms, molecules, and organisms if you're using atomic design methodology. So they are often part of a design system or a UI component library. Those are reusable presentational components. So they're all about a button component or whatever, a date picker, and all of these common things. So he was asking about Storybook, and we can actually use fake container components to test the reusable presentational components, and we can combine this technique with Storybook or Angular Playground. And Storybook, if you don't know it, it's kind of an interactive documentation for your components. It sets up a React app for your Angular app so that you can test your components and trigger state changes and see what it looks like and add some documentation. And this is nice for collaborating with designers or just creating a kitchen sink for your design system, or even showing it off to your stakeholders, such as your product owner or your UX designer or your backend developers or whatever. And just even for developer documentation, it's pretty nice when you have developed your own design system to have a Storybook instance. Yeah, so you can even combine it with end-to-end testing. And an example of this, Narwhal created a video on YouTube, even though it's called High Quality React Apps with NX, Storybook, and Cypress. The same technique can be used for Angular applications. So you can combine Angular, your reusable presentation components. You can set them up in Storybook. You might use container components with fake data. And then you can add Cypress on top of your Storybook app to click the buttons of Storybook and make assertions on what does the DOM render like in that component in this Storybook page. And he was also asking about visual regression testing. So you can add that on top of Storybook as well. So these are just these are great examples of how you can test the reusable presentational components. Yeah, you can even use snapshot tests on top of Storybooks. It's also great for Storybook is also great for manual testing and just exploring your reusable presentational components. But do you really want to test every feature manually, every behavior for every merge or release? No, that's why you can't choose to add Cypress on top of that, or snapshot testing, for example, or even just visual regression testing, because the Storybook should always render the same unless you introduce a change. So you can use visual regressing test or the snapshot test. And if something changed, you need to decide, was this intentional? Was it a feature, or was it a breaking change? Yeah. So we can also choose to test the reusable presentational components with the test bed. It's actually perfectly fine for testing them. And they don't require any stop dependencies. So it's a bit easier to set them up with testbed than some of the other tests, like the router testing module. So to test the input properties, you would either use a host component or set the values on input properties and then call fixture detect changes. For testing the output properties of this component, that's not really convenient without a host component, because then you need to treat them as observables and subscribe to them and remember to unsubscribe. So if you do test them with testbed, probably go for a host component. So again, it's based on what you have experience with, because of course it takes some effort to set up a Storybook, Cypress, and snapshot testing, and visual regression test. And if you haven't done that before, of course the effort is even larger. But if you have done that before, that might be the best option to you, and you might not even need to test bed at all for your reusable presentational components. And Eunice is sad to leave. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
It's being
Bye,
recorded.
Eunice.
You can catch the ending later.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I have run out of water.
Yeah,
Uh,
sure. You can find it.
maybe you can ask for questions, or we can take a 5-minute break or something, and I'll run for
Uh,
some.
there is one question and that is related to how to test the performance of functions in unit testing.
Yeah. So I'm using the tool called Wallaby, Wallaby.js. It's a paid
Mm-hmm.
tool. It's like if you're used to having something like ESLint or TSLint extensions in your editor, you have these inline notifications of errors. And Wallaby, one of its core functions is you get that, but for testing. So you can see
Mm-hmm.
inline in the code which test is failing and which class has failing tests. And it also has an apt or even built into the editor. You can see your test coverage for different classes, and you can also see the performance. So inline for every test, it'll show this test took 5 milliseconds to run and so on. So that's a great tool for profiling your test. It even has a specialized profiler tool for optimizing your unit tests. It even has some built-in functionalities for test performance optimizing your code, because you can try out different algorithms or different ways of the same implementation, and you can run it many times just using Wallaby, and it will show you the average time, the max time, and the minimum time, and so on. So that's one good tool for that. It's free for open source. So if you're working on an open source project, you can use Wallaby for free. You just give them your email address and they'll send you a license. But you can only use it for open source. It does
Mm-hmm.
check which repos you're working on. So if you're working on other repos with that activated, you will have to pay for it.
Okay.
It's around $200 a year for company license and half of that for a personal license. Yeah, but that's a great tool. Performance measurements for tests. Yeah, I think you can even do a test execution report with some testing frameworks, and something like Sonar Cloud can support those reports, and then you can get a report of the performance of your different tests, and you can see if you have performance degradations in your tests. Then something changed in your code, and that's a good indicator of that. There's probably a lot of other tools that I don't have top of mind or am aware of right now, but yeah, there's certainly some tools for that. Yeah, can we take
Thank
like a
you.
3-minute break? I'll go for some
Yeah,
water.
sure. Yep. We'll be back in few minutes. So meanwhile, if you have any questions, feel free to actually send it here. We'll take it back. We'll take it once we are back.
Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Lars. Yep,
Nice.
we are back.
Yeah, I have about 30 slides left. Half of them are,
Mm-hmm.
or 20, 15 or 20 of them are spectacular. So we're getting to that. So that's the majority of the rest of this presentation. And of course, if it's getting too late or you can't focus anymore, because this is a lot to take in, of course, you can catch the recording later on YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this was about, now we're done with the techniques for presentational components, and hopefully you
Mm-hmm.
have a better understanding about should I test them, how can I test them. Depends on the type of the presentational test, and it's like for the reusable presentation components, something like Storybook and end-to-end test or visual regression test, that's absolutely a great idea. But if your only setup is testbed, you can even solve it using just a testbed.
Mm-hmm.
So now we come to the section about Angular testing libraries, and this is based on question from Ajit.
Yep. So best details to use reduce test bed code and framework test boilerplate.
Yes. So as we have seen, Angular tests, there's a lot of code to set up the
Yeah.
Angular testing module and all of that. And yeah, the sad thing is you really need to understand Angular modules to be able to set up your test properly, because it's like having one app module when you need to set everything up that you're going to need for your tests. So it's not very easy for beginners. So
Yeah.
that's sad. But fortunately, there's a ton of different options. Like
Mm-hmm.
and common for this is they all try to hide away the boilerplate of the test bed. With the exception of the Angular CDK component test harness, it has a bit of a different design. Like it's for making sure your tests are independent from the internal structure of a UI component library like
Mm-hmm.
Angular Material. And it allows you to run the same tests in end-to-end tests and also unit and integration tests. So basically, you can create a component test harness for each of your design system components, or some come with the Angular Material. There's a test harness for I think every one of their components. So that makes it easier for your tests because you can use this test harness, which
Mm-hmm.
is an API specifically designed for testing those components. The Angular testing library by Tim DeSchreier is also
Mm-hmm.
a special one because it's from the testing library family, which is made by Kent C. Dodds, but Tim maintains and created the Angular testing library. And that the philosophy of that is test as a user. So you can look at what's in the DOM, you can click the buttons, but you can't know about components. We don't want to know about the implementation details that Angular components are. We want to test through the DOM, and maybe we'll
Mm-hmm.
combine it with the mock service worker to see how it affects the backend. Everything else in here is trying to hide away the dirty details of the test bed and how you set that up. And there's a bunch of them. They are all maintained, as far as I could tell. Spectator in the bottom is a very popular one by ng-neat.
Mm-hmm.
It has a spectator class for testing components, a spectator class for testing routed components, and one for HTTP client test, and so on. And the new kid on the block here is the bottom one, Spectacular, which is an upcoming member of our NG worker family. So this is the question by Jerome. Do you plan to
And
talk about Spectacular? And yeah, I did this just for you, Jerome. I finished, I stabilized the first APIs with the help of Santosh and Serkan and Nacho. So we didn't release it yet, but it's close, and you can go download it from our CI workflow if you want to try it out. But we're pretty happy with the API and the first three different features of it right now. We even had a logo created, so now it's official. It isn't on npm yet, but should come pretty soon. So Spectacular is an integration testing library for Angular applications and libraries, and it focuses on integration tests.
Mhm.
So the first features are the application testing API, the feature testing API, and the pipe testing API. And big shout out to Felipe, who created the logo for Lumberjack and for Spectacular as well. The only downside is that it's pretty close to Spectator, so that's a different testing library, a nice one. This one is a little different because it has no dependencies on Jasmine or Jest, so you
Mhm.
can use it with any testing framework. It's even the feature testing API is built to be able to be integrated with the Angular testing library and the Angular CDK component harnesses, or you can just use it on your own. Then you'll have to do a little, you might have to do some testbed configuration
Mhm.
yourself, but most of it is also hidden away. We're reducing the boilerplates, and many Spectacular test doesn't import the testbed at all. So first one up is the application testing API. This allows us to test these very special things, the application hooks, the application initializers, the bootstrap listeners, and configuration Angular modules, which runs some initializes a library or something like that. That's actually close to impossible with the testbed. I got some inspiration from the Angular source code from their own test
Mhm.
cases. Um, they were doing some special magic. I stole that and modified it a bit and put it into a library so that everyone is able to use it. So here, as soon as we have it on npm, or if you download it, the zip file from our CI workflow, you'll be able to import create application harness from ng worker Spectacular. It's not a component test harness like the one from Angular CDK. Um, it's a factory method that sets up the testbed for you and gives you some testing APIs. So here, this is an example from our own code base, our own tests for Spectacular. I set up this application bootstrap listener, and when it's called, it will set the
Mhm.
bootstrap variable to true. So as you can see in the highlighted line here, we call create application harness. It does return some things, but we don't need it for this test. But we do provide this bootstrap listener, and this is the same thing you would do in your application when adding this bootstrap listener or any bootstrap listener. And then we check that it was actually run because now the bootstrap variable will be set to true. So yeah, a very simple bootstrap listener, but it's just to show that it's actually possible because you can't really do this with the testbed itself. You have to do some special things that Spectacular will do for you. And yeah, it has the same API for the application initializers and any module that contains them as well.
Mhm.
So just the crown jewel of Spectacular is the feature testing API. It bridges the gap between component tests and end-to-end tests. So it tries to have the sweet spot here where it has the speed, so the execution speed and the utilities of testbed, but with the test as a user approach of the end-to-end testing frameworks or the Angular testing library approach as well. And like I said, it can be integrated with these other two popular libraries. And so you can get the nice user interaction APIs of Angular testing library, but you can use Spectacular to set up to configure the test bed for example, what we saw earlier with the router testing module. It will do most of that for you. So it can the feature test harness can be used to test the routed feature modules and the shell modules. And if you download the presentation, you'll see a link to an article by Nacho and me about different shell modules.
Mhm.
Um, so it configures the router testing module. It manages the related test setup with the test bed, and it adds a couple of services on top of that that are more like they are not necessary, but they are convenient for the integration tests, the feature integration tests. So there's the spectacular feature router and the spectacular feature location service. And here's some example usage. We set up the harness by using create feature harness, and we pass it a feature module. This is the crisis center module from Tour of Heroes. We pass it the route path of this feature module, which is crisis center. And now we have our testing harness set up and no mention of testbed at all. And this service is on the harness.router property, the spectacular feature router. And as we can see here, it allows us to use the tilde operator or symbol, the curly symbol here, for feature relative navigation. So when I call tilde/details, it will navigate to crisis center/details. And the location service will return the route in a similar way. It's relative to the feature module I'm testing. It's just tilde/details. And of course, we can test that this is actually working as expected here by here we pull out the actual Angular router service, and we tell it to navigate to /crisis center/details, and the spectacular location service will still return tilde/details. So it will remove the crisis center part that's common to all the routes in this feature module. So yeah, that's the same thing. We pull out Angular's own location service. We use the feature router to navigate to tilde/details. And in Angular's own location service, we can see that it does return /crisis center/details. So it just removes some repetition from a test suite for a feature module. This is so this is from the actual. I'm testing the Tour of Hero Crisis Center module. It's set up in a separate library in the Spectacular repo, but it doesn't have an application. So this shows off the power of integration tests. You can develop a whole feature in isolation. You don't even have to have an app. You can navigate around all the routes inside of that feature module. You can click the buttons. You can verify that the change, the source of the change, and the target of the change. So I tested the Crisis Center feature without an application by using the feature harness from Spectacular. That's what we're seeing here. We create the feature harness, we're parsing it, the feature module again, and the Crisis Center route path, and we're just replacing the dialog service with a fake dialog service. That's something you can't do in end-to-end testing. The dialog service of this application from Angular documentation, it actually shows you the prompt, the JavaScript prompt that will show up on your screen, and you have to click OK or cancel. Maybe some end-to-end testing framework can manage that, but good luck. Whereas when we have the test bed available, we can just replace it with a fake service, and that's what I did here. So we're creating our feature harness, and then we have these user interaction testing utilities. They're not included in Spectacular. But if you want something like that, you should use the Angular testing library instead. It's not something we want to create or maintain in Spectacular. You can use the test bed like we have done here for our own utilities, or you can use Angular testing library for something like that. So these are there's a couple of helper functions for assertions to make the test cases more clear and concise. So they call these user interactions utilities. and get text. So it's basically just querying the test bed for that the component fixture. It's getting that element, and it's pulling out the text content from that element just for convenience sakes, and to tell you which part of the application you are currently navigated to. So we'll see that used now in the actual test cases. So this is just this is an excerpt. So it's just some of the test cases from a huge integration test suite for most of the crisis center module from the Two of Heroes routing tutorial. So we actually have several test hooks here because they are all reused between several test cases, but I only show one of the test cases here. So you can see that there's multiple things happening. First, we use the feature router from Spectacular to navigate to the detail page for this crisis. So we pass in the crisis ID of some crisis. And next step, we see, let's see here. Yeah, we're entering some text using our utilities, another crisis name. And then when we cancel that change, instead of saying we want to save it, we will cancel it. We click the cancel button, and then this dialog will show up. And using our fake service, we can click OK. And then we can assert that we're back at the Crisis Center homepage, and the crisis we were editing is still selected. Yeah, I don't know why I showed this one. I guess I mess up with the slides, but yeah. So this is an example of many classes are tested here, but we're not mentioning anything about components at all. We're testing as a user, mostly. Like we're using the router service, but that's similar to entering a URL in the browser. We're clicking buttons that the user can see. We're entering input, and we're verifying where we ended up, which URL, which feature did we end up on. That's an example of the power of the feature testing API, where a whole feature module is tested. Many components are available. You can route across many routes and see where you end up. And you could even continue like, okay, so now I'm at the homepage, and now I click a different hero, and that's the one I wanted to put in the new name of, and so on. So you can make them as large as you want. And this is possible with testbed. It's just not very easy. So Spectacular, the feature testing harness, will make it easier. So it's still very advanced, but you get some benefits, right? You now have the speed of the testbed compared to the end-to-end testing framework, and you have the utilities, for example, to replace that dialog with a fake service, because it makes it more convenient, and it might not even be possible in your end-to-end testing framework to click the OK button of a prompt.
Yeah.
Is there any questions, or because I have one more API?
No, but doesn't look like any.
Okay. The final one that's part of this initial version we're preparing of Spectacular is the pipe testing API. It's for Angular pipes. So it will manage a host component for you. It'll run the change detection, but it will be transparent to you. So you don't have to set all of this up. You don't even have to know there's a host component or that change detection is being run. It will be very simple to test a pipe, but it will be tested with an actual component and an actual DOM. Well, actual as in created by the testing framework. But you're good at as putting it in an actual template and trying it out yourself.
Yeah.
Without
So generally, we create a component and then use the pipe inside that, and then use it in test bed.
Yes, exactly. Because you can unit test pipes, but yeah, you still don't know if like what does it look like when I pass parameters to this pipe? Does it actually work, or is it importing? Does it pass a string and I want a number? Like it's difficult to catch these things because you decide the types. So you can trick TypeScript into thinking something else is coming, but you'll get past a string, for example. Yeah, so Spectacular will set this up for you. You can read the text that's rendered by passing a value through your pipe. The value can be changed. It'll set up a default template where it just passes the value through the pipe, but you can change that template yourself initially or even during the test. You can now I want to change it to passing another parameter, and now I want to change the value, and there's no root fixture or host fixture detect changes. Spectacular handles that for you. So this is what it looks like. We have create pipe harness and the Spectacular pipe harness type from Spectacular. We use it down here in our before each test hook. We set up a pipe harness. We pass it. In this case, it's just an example pipe called capitalize, and try to read the implementation and guess what it does or whether it's correct. With this test, we will see that it is correct and it is working as a pipe. We pass it the capitalized pipe class. We pass it the name. Capitalized is the pipe name, right? And we pass it a value. It's Mr. Potato Head with lowercase. And now we go down and see we have this harness inside of the test case, and we will verify that it capitalizes. So the first letter of each word in its text will be transformed into uppercase. So we will see that once this text has been passed through the pipe, it will be Mr. Potato Head with the proper title case. And now we will even change the value. It's just assigning a property here. We'll change it to lowercase Miss Potato Head, and we will read the text property of the harness and see that it has now been updated to Mrs. Potato Head or Miss Potato Head with proper title case. That's all we have today for about Spectacular. It will be published as at ngworkers/spectacular until it's available. You can feel free to try it out from the build artifacts of our GitHub Actions workflow. And the roadmap currently for it is we will try to have verified cross-version compatibility with Angular like we have with Lumberjack. Lumberjack 2.0 works with every version 9.x, 10.x, 11.x of Angular. And we'll try to do the same for one version of Spectacular, so you don't have to keep updating it all the time. So it will also get examples of integrating it with Angular CDK component harness and Angular testing libraries. And at some point, we'll add a container component test harness as well.
That's nice.
And Mahmoud is excited. Nice. Yeah. So I have one final section. It's a short one. It's about automated testing and legacy systems. And I don't know if we have our good friend Armin here, but maybe you can read his questions.
Yeah, so Armin has this question: is writing unit tests really increasing the time spent on developers significantly, or does the early planning and relative bug safety compensate for the time we spend on writing unit tests in Angular? Lots of client companies don't want developers writing unit tests because they think it will take too much time and they don't want to overpay.
Yeah. So let me ask you all a question. Would you add unit tests if you were programming a satellite for deep space exploration and it would be sent to outer space for 40 years and you wouldn't have a chance to update its software? Would you add unit tests?
Yes, of course.
Something to think about. So let me ask you another question. Do you hope and pray that the software for your car's brakes is tested automatically?
Yes.
How about your pacemaker or your insulin dispenser? Do you hope that the software running them is covered by automated unit tests?
Of course, because of course my life depends on it.
Yeah, exactly. So, a final question: which is less expensive, manual testing or automated testing? And I'm talking over time, not like initial upfront cost. I'm talking every time you make a release, you have to go through
Yep.
scripted manual tests, or you have to hope that you tried it out properly on your computer and it works on not only your machine. Or is that more expensive than automated testing that will run every time you create a new release?
I think manual testing is always costly because I have worked in an organization where we just depend on the testers, right? And we still depend on the testers.
Yeah, so either you will have people employed to do manual testing, the same tests again and again
Actually,
and again, week after week, or you hope that your developers are testing it manually because they really like manual tests. So, yeah, but of course, the software company or the team should, or in my opinion, they should be the ones insisting on automated testing. It shouldn't even be a discussion.
right.
Uh, of course, the effort should fit the system and the business domain. Like, how critical is it? Like, is it deep space exploration? Is it a pacemaker? Is it a car? Is it a nuclear bomb? You probably want to add test to that. Or is
Right.
it just a calendar app for your phone? I mean, it's not, it doesn't kill anyone, hopefully, if there's a bug in your calendar app, but it will certainly kill someone if there's a bug in your car's brake system. So, how critical is it? But also, how expensive is it and how impactful
Mhm.
are the failures? Like, if there is a bug in production, how much does it cost to repair that bug, and what's the worst that can happen? Another issue to consider is how expensive and how fast is your deployment. Because if there's a bug in production and it takes you 4 weeks to schedule a release cycle because you need people from different teams and you need it reviewed by security, and yeah, it's going to be expensive and a big pain for your company. Of
I
course,
agree.
yeah, but of course, also, is the team familiar with automated testing? Uh, or maybe they're familiar with end-to-end testing, but not unit tests. Of course, there will be an upfront cost, but it's something like within a month they should be pretty comfortable, and it'll only increase over time. But the team should decide that this is their values. We want automated tests, and this is our testing strategy, and it's not up for discussion. Like, it's the way we
Yeah.
do. It's the way we ensure quality for the customer. It's the way we can work in confidence that we're not breaking the software, and we really don't want to spend our time doing manual tests. It's also more expensive in the long run.
Yep, agreed. I mean, just to give you a real-time example, the organization where I used to work, like 5 years ago, we were actually running everything on manual testing, and there was one feature release which costed us around like 5 lakh NR Indian rupees, but it's still big. It's around, if you have to count, it's like around $8,000. That's what it actually, we were in that much loss just because there was just manual testing, and how you redeem your points, it was all related to points. Testers were not aware of it, so they never used to check if I'm redeeming a product worth 100 rupees or $100, only $100 are getting deducted from my account. So the scenario was like people are redeeming product worth $100, but they are just paying $25. So of course, it happens when you have manual testing.
Yeah. I have a personal example as well. I have several, but I'll share one right now. I used to work in e-commerce companies, and in one of them, we didn't have, we didn't even have, we probably had a testing environment, but when you're doing an e-commerce, a web shop, you have a testing payment gateway,
Uh-huh.
and it might not be like the real one. So um, did we test against the testing environment or did we test in production? I can't remember, but anyways, every time we deployed the smallest change to a web shop, just one line of JavaScript code, we had to go through manual steps of testing
Mm-hmm.
the whole checkout workflow manually on every imaginable device. Like you need an Android phone, you need an Android tablet, an iPhone, an iPad, a Mac, a Windows, and so on. We had to do it for every single change because
My God.
it's very expensive for web shops when the checkout pay flow is not working. And
Yeah.
there was a bad experience of there was a button, the checkout button didn't work on an iPad, but the developer didn't test on an iPad, so they were unaware. It cost the company 50, like 8,000 euros or so for that mistake
Wow.
because it was broken for 1 hour, that button.
Wow.
And imagine you did that mistake for Amazon, it would have cost you $1 million
Yeah.
for that mistake.
Sure.
It's not like I enjoyed doing it, so it's not a uh, like I'm not spending my time very very well doing that.
Mm-hmm.
I could make a mistake as well. I could forget one of the steps. You just check off the box. Yeah, I did it, right? But with automated tests, you can reproduce this test every
Yeah.
single time for
Agreed.
every single change. It's a lot less expensive than the manual tests, a lot less error prone in general. So yeah, so that's my reply to Armin. It's up to you as a company and as a team to make this part of your values, and it's not even up for discussion. Like uh, I don't tell the person building my house how he's going to do it. We just agree what it should look like and maybe the materials, but I don't intervene if he lays down 10 bricks at a time or if he uses a what kind of measuring device he uses, if he uses laser pointers or whatever. I just trust that he does a good job and we have agreed the price, right?
Yeah.
And I know that his work is high quality because my house
Mhm.
doesn't fall apart, right? So same thing here. The customer will notice that you're doing a good job. There's not as many bugs, and they can really trust your new features, and you can spend your time writing features instead of going back to the old feature and fixing it because there was a bug you didn't catch.
Yeah.
One more question from Armin. That's the last one.
Yeah. So his question is TTD is nice and shiny. Lots of huge code bases out there don't have tests already, but would benefit from adding them. Is it worth trying to add unit tests to a large existing project? What is the best sequence of steps we can make to make it less painful? Yeah, great question.
So TDD is test-driven development.
Development. Yeah.
So that's a test-first approach. So, like, if we're getting technical here, you can't retrofit TDD to existing features. You can't add
Mm-hmm.
TDD because you
Yeah.
do TDD, you would have to write the test before the code. So you can't write the test afterwards. Like you can add automated tests, but it's not TDD. Test-driven development is test first, so you have to write the test before the actual code. But what we can do is we can do exploratory testing. So, for example, I joined a company which with a big code base. There were no automated tests and no documentation and no one to tell me what was going on, and the people who knew what's going on didn't have time. So, so what did I do? Because I had to change one of these very complex use cases of the applications, and I had no idea what was going on. So I added test coverage to that part of the code. And it was not easy because it didn't have automated tests. So the design was not very good because one of the things you get with automated tests, well, not end-to-end tests. They don't care about the architecture of your application. But with good unit tests and integration tests, you will generally get a much nicer design of your
Mm-hmm.
whole code base because you need a nice design to be able to test it. When you're not testing it, you can break all the architectural best practices and you might not even notice it. But with tests, you'll notice straight away that this is hard to test. Yeah, it's probably a poor design of the code. So yeah, we can add test coverage, and once we have test coverage, we can do refactoring. because technically you can't refactor code without tests because you don't know
Yep.
if you're breaking it. I mean, you can have manual tests, sure, but you need some type, some kind of reproducible test, or you won't know if you have broken anything. So I basically did something similar to a snapshot test of what that endpoint on the API had to change returned with different parameters. And now I could start to restructure or refactor the parts of that web API endpoint until I felt comfortable in what's going on. I couldn't figure out all the details, but I knew that the automated test had my back, and every possible request that could be sent to that endpoint was still returning the same response. So after refactoring it, because I added tests, now I could start working on a new feature, and the design was improved because the tests, and I had to figure out how to add the test, right? So the design was better. So implementing the actual feature was a walk in the park compared to before. And if I hadn't done that, I would have spent several like 2, 3, 4 times the amount of time for implementing the feature because I had to figure out what was going on, and it would be the exact same situation next time I had to sort of add a feature for that particular API. So what are good approaches for introducing tests to an existing code base? Well, you can, if you get a bug, if you get a bug report, you can make sure you cover the parts of the code that has the bug, you cover that with tests. So that can be the first place you add the test. You probably shouldn't try to add tests to the whole thing at once, because you will spend months doing that, depending on the size
Yeah.
of the code base. But if you get a bug, you can reproduce it with a test, and then you'll know when you have actually fixed the bug, and that bug won't come back because you'll have an automated test flow to verify that it's still working as expected. That's one technique you can do. Another one is every time you create a new feature, you will add test coverage. And that was similar to my story. I started by covering the existing feature with then I could start refactoring, and then I could, like, refactoring is changing the internals without changing the
Yep.
behavior. That's refactoring. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot, but technically refactoring is rearranging the code base without changing any public behavior or API. You can
Right.
also restructure the code. That's when you intentionally make a change. But before that, you should know what was the old behavior. Then you can modify your test to the new behavior. Then you can restructure the code or add a new feature. And now you should have the test passing again. And if you don't, well, you can roll back to the old implementation, and you had test coverage there showing that it was working, and start working again on another approach for that feature. Yeah, so that's two good techniques: cover bugs with tests, cover new features with tests, or when you're changing existing parts of the code, cover that as well with tests. Another good tool is an example of that is Sonar Cloud. It can help you set limits for new code that's added. You can say for every new code I add in a PR, it should have 85% test coverage, for example. But for the existing code, it has 0% test coverage, but that's fine. We don't want to cover all of that now, but every new piece of code we add, we want a high test coverage. Sonar Cloud is one example that can set that up, like one configuration for new code and another test coverage threshold for the existing code base. That's pretty nice for working with this issue. That's it from me. And this is my Twitter handle, LazyDK. And this is my employer, System8 in Denmark.
Thanks a lot, Lars. So I think it was just an entire, I think, 2.5 hour workshop. I think anyone who is looking for testing, I think you should go and watch the entire video. You will get a lot of inputs, and I'm looking forward for Spectacular, the library. I can see some values already, and great to be part of it. So though I don't understand that much testing, but yes, I could actually see the value because it will make my life easier testing the feature module basically, and the pipe one was really nice. So thanks again for joining, and basically for like giving the idea where we can collect the questions from community rather than actually discussing about something. So that was really great, and we got a lot of amazing questions. And yeah, I think that is what Vijay says. So I think Vijay has some question. Tests take quite a lot of time. Do you run E2E tests for every PR or master merge?
Yes, I run it for every commit, every merge, every time.
Mhm.
So, so this is where tooling can help you. Um, Maybe not with end-to-end test. Well, like if
Mhm.
you have several apps, um, NX can help you. For example, NX can
Mhm.
what's called intelligent or smart test runs. So it can say, well, only this app has changed. So I'll only run the end-to-end test for this application, not the other 3 or 4 or 10 apps. So in that case, your test execution time will be reduced to a tenth of running the whole thing. So usually that's what we use in my company. We use the
Mhm.
intelligent linting and testing and building that NX provides.
Mhm.
So we use that for the PR commits. But once we merge to main branch, we will run everything just to make sure. That's usually how it goes, and
Ah,
it's the same. It's the same with our mono repos like ng worker, nx worker.
mhm. Affected test you mean
Yeah,
affected test and affected.
the
Okay,
nx
cool.
affected command. Yes.
Yeah.
So that's my way of doing it. Is in the PR we'll run the nx affected, but once it gets merged to main, you will run just everything like nx run
Mhm. Right.
tests.
Right. Okay. Cool. So Chris has this question. I apologize if this had been asked, but does everyone prefer Karma and Protector, the defaults, or does everyone use just in Cypress?
Yeah, your question was answered earlier, Chris. So
Yeah.
please go back. I gave my advice. Like I listed what's upsides and downsides to Protractor and to Cypress from my point of view. Um, I have a lot of experience with Protractor, not as much with Cypress, but it's just my
Mhm.
opinion on what's the positive sides of Cypress and what's the negative sides. The same for Karma and Protractor. So uh, depending on your needs. For example, if you have to test in Internet Explorer or Microsoft Edge Legacy or Safari, Cypress is not an option. So you have to go for something like Protractor or some of the other 10 end-to-end testing frameworks I mentioned.
Mhm. So I think we are done. In case you have any question, Lars already shared his Twitter handle. So you can always reach out to him on Twitter. He's available there. And yes, you can also join the Discord server we have. You can also speak to him on Discord server. He's really active everywhere. I'm not sure how he gets time, but yes, he is. Uh, and apart from that, Lars, so do you want to promote anything on our channel?
Yeah, while we were having this stream, I got my Twitter follower number 2000. I will make
Ah,
sure to send you a virtual certificate of achievement,
ah,
and you can do whatever you like. You can hang it on your wall. I'm very happy for it. Santosh, you have recommended people to follow me. I'm very happy for
ah,
that. Some of them
ah,
have already left again. They didn't like it,
uh-huh.
so, but yeah, that's me. You like me or you don't, and I'm very open to expressing my opinion on a lot of like sometimes you don't want to hear the things that are inconvenient or not very nice or doesn't fit
Yeah,
your
agree.
perspective on the world, but other times like it can be helpful to see someone other than your own opinion and get outside of your bubble, and that's what I try to promote, like looking at things from
Hmm.
another perspective.
Yeah.
I see VJ says I'm giving him nightmares with my tweets about the future of Angular. So I can promote one more thing. I have been asked to um, be a speaker at an event called the Battle of the Frameworks. I will
Hmm.
be representing Angular.
Okay.
Someone else will be representing Vue and React, and I don't know, maybe Svelte.
Mhm.
So yeah, you can get my opinion in that show. I'll make sure to tweet about it once it's prepared.
Great. Looking forward to that. I mean, so as you said, right? So everyone has their own opinion. I think it's good to have opinions, right? I mean, at least you are saying, so if I love Angular, it's not like I will always be, or I'll be always be speaking good about that framework. If it has some downside, I think we should go ahead and tell, okay, this is downside, and I think we should fix it rather than actually saying, no, 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 you're bad, or your opinions are bad for the community. I think it's more of how people take it. So it's absolutely fine. I mean, so let it be. Cool. So thanks again, Lars, for joining us. And as I said, we next week we have two episodes coming up. One with Mark, who is the creator of NGXS, and he will be joining us on Monday, 10 p.m. Yeah, 10 p.m. IST. And then we will have Sam Julian on next Friday. We'll be talking about auto, I mean, identity and everything. Yep. So see you next week. And meanwhile, in case you have any questions, feel free to connect to us on Twitter. And if you can follow him, that will be great. And so recently so this channel got more than 750 subscribers. Thanks for doing that. I generally don't promote, go ahead and subscribe to channel, but in case you want to, you are free to do that. Yeah. So see you next week. Bye bye.
Bye.